Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are covering the Battle of Britain, which came out in 1969, so a little while ago. It's a film directed by Guy Hamilton and written by James Kennaway and Wilfred Greatorex. It's based on a book called The Narrow Margin, The Battle of Britain and the Rise of Air Power from 1930 to 1949. That book came out in 1961 by Derek Wood and Derek Dempster. They sure do like their Dereks over there. The movie attempts to faithfully depict real-life figures involved in the Battle of Britain on the ground and over the skies of Great Britain in 1940. And if you're wondering, there are many characters, and you will forget all of them because they're not very distinctive. You can watch this if you want. You probably should. It's interesting. On Amazon Prime. What did you think of it, Sam?
I don't think they really make movies like this anymore. There's not really a central character or group of characters. They made the attempt, I guess, but mostly it's kind of this documentary style. Here's what happened during the Battle of Britain. Here's the central figures. Here's what they were talking about. A guy might pop up and never pop up again, and it hasn't really been streamlined in any way, and you're just supposed to be able to kind of follow along. I think they assume the audience has quite a lot of context already, and based on when it came out, they're probably right. I thought the aerial combat scenes were pretty cool. This is a period, of course, when they would have been able to use a lot of real planes. They would have used a lot of practical effects. And the result is kind of neat to watch, especially because, given the passage of time, there will never be another World War II aerial battle filmed with all of these actual planes, with all these practical effects. Of course, we would use what's available now. We would use CGI, etc. So I enjoyed that. And I also liked that there was a female main character with stuff to do. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force was quite a major part of the Battle of Britain, and they did attempt to show them in this movie. They also got some accolades in the book, which I read, and so I did enjoy that aspect. I will say that I found the book very technical. If you're really interested in makes and models of airplanes and types of engines and how many of each make and model were manufactured in which year, then you'll enjoy the book. And the back half of the book is essentially a day-by-day account of the Battle of Britain, what got bombed, how many planes were lost on each side, how many sorties were flown. So it's very thoroughly researched, very exhaustive. I did learn a lot. It was a little dry, and I found that dryness translated into the movie. What did you think of it?
I think you pretty much already summed it up. I didn't know a lot about the Battle of Britain, strangely, but I do now. So they've done a good job in educating me, and I am curious to see maybe other movies depicting this battle with maybe a little bit more storytelling. I didn't care particularly much about many of the characters because a lot of them are like higher ups on brass, and even the characters that weren't necessarily based on real people, they didn't have that many interesting things to do, so I don't know. It's good, but it's not great. I thought it was quite long, and I feel like I lacked the context that they are kind of assuming you have going into the movie. So in the beginning, I was like, what's happening? Where are we? What's going on? But it got slightly better as the movie progressed. And they did have, I think, real Germans in this, which was fun. But I don't know if I would watch it again. Probably not. So overall, the music made me laugh though. The music is fun. It's like really old-timey fanfare music.
Yeah, definitely. I think I read somewhere that the original music for the movie was even more patriotic and Our Glorious War, and then they redid it before the movie came out. I think that was this movie that I read that about. But yeah, actually, like you said, this movie is kind of like Tora, the movie that we covered about Pearl Harbor, where you get the Japanese perspective and the American perspective. This movie was kind of like that. We did get to see what the Germans were doing and what the brass were talking about on their side as well. And the book does cover that. It's ostensibly just a history of the Battle of Britain. It's not supposed to be from the British perspective, but you can really tell that the two authors are British. Well, I think one of them was born elsewhere in the empire, but he did come to Britain and join the RAF. That's quite clear to me from the book. Like, for example, I had previously read that the British really underestimated the Germans' radar ability early in the war for probably too long with disastrous results. And in this book, they presented it the other way around. So I just thought it was interesting that you can tell who wrote it and what their motivations are.
I feel like that's also true for the movie because the Germans are a little bit silly sometimes.
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, let's get into it because we have a lot of notes. Here's the plot. So we start in France in May 1940. A plane, which is piloted by Jamie, played by James Cosmo, does a victory roll over a group of French refugees fleeing Paris. And his squadron leader, Colin Harvey, played by Christopher Plummer, very dashing, doesn't really like it that he does that. And he kind of chews him out for it. And also he's Canadian.
Yes, very excited to see not only Christopher Plummer, who of course is Canadian, but also he's playing an RCAF pilot, so that's nice.
And as we open the scene, we see that the British pilots in the area have to evacuate because the Germans are coming, and they have to destroy any planes that they can't take with them, which is a shame. It like hurt me to see them throw gasoline on these beautiful Spitfires and Hurricanes.
Yeah, because they, of course, after many aerial battles, they would have planes that weren't airworthy, and you don't want the technology to fall into German hands. May 19th, 1940 is the date, more or less, when most British squadrons evacuated as the German army rushed towards them. The last squadrons didn't leave until the Dunkirk evacuation was complete, but this is kind of the mark of the British going, fuck, we have underestimated the scale of the problem. Better pack up and go home and ready ourselves for what comes next.
It's funny to me that the battle was ultimately won by the British because the Germans did have larger numbers and not by a little, like by a lot. So, but I guess you can never underestimate the British either, which is what I think did happen.
Yeah. I mean, there were some issues with German leadership. Well, we'll get into all of it, I suppose. So, the British Expeditionary Force, who had come to France to support the French, Belgian, and Dutch people when they were invaded by the Germans, they're evacuating at Dunkirk. This is a disastrous situation, hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the beach. France is about to capitulate to the Germans. We get a scene where Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, played by Laurence Olivier, by the way, he's important because he's going to serve as the air officer commanding of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command during the upcoming Battle of Britain. So we get introduced to him here, and he's explaining how he's prioritizing home defense over sending more planes across the channel. And this decision by Dowding is true to life. The Germans achieved air superiority over the obsolete and underprepared French Air Force, supported by squadrons of the British Royal Air Force in about 2 days. And the British continued to send additional squadrons, but they ended up losing a ream of their best pilots in the process and 25% of their total interceptor strength. And so Dowding wrote to the Undersecretary of State at the War Ministry towards the end of the Battle of France, saying basically, if we lose in France, that defeat will involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country as well. So we get to see him make that decision in real time in the movie. And then we get a Churchill quote from June 18th, 1940, where he says, "The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." And the name of the book upon which this movie is based, The Narrow Margin, also comes from a Churchill quote. He had said, "All the great struggles of history have been won by superior willpower, resting victory in the teeth of odds or upon the narrowest of margins."
That's such a bombastic quote, isn't it? I'm like, what does this mean?
Yeah, Churchill, he's a little full of himself sometimes, he's full of hot air.
Larger than life.
And Dowding was actually one of several participants in the Battle of Britain who consulted on this movie.
He also visited, I think, the set of his office that was recreated to look exactly the same, I think, which I think is pretty neat.
Yeah, they do have a lot of attention to detail in this movie. If it can be historically accurate, it more or less is.
We watch as the Luftwaffe make preparations to attack Britain by air, and we are at the British Embassy in Switzerland, where the British ambassador Sir David Kelly, played by Rolf Richardson, and the German ambassador Baron von Richter, played by Kurt Jürgens, discuss how Germany really doesn't want to invade Britain, but they will if Britain doesn't let them do what they want on the continent. He says, Europe is ours. The scene was kind of funny to me because the British ambassador is just like, how many sugars do you want in your tea again? Is it two? And it made me laugh.
Yeah, it's funny this diplomacy on the eve of warfare, right? And I mean, Hitler really did respect the British, but I don't think if you're Germany, who's taken over the bulk of the continent, you can risk, having the British at your back undefeated, especially if your next plan is to potentially take on the Soviets.
Exactly. And then as the Baron leaves, we do see David Kelly kind of saying to, I don't know, his secretary maybe, I don't remember, but that they are in trouble. He doesn't say it to the Baron, but he does say it behind closed doors.
Yeah. Now it's June 1940. We see air sector controllers being trained on how to guide planes in the air. So, this would be when you have squadrons of planes being scrambled, you need to be able to guide them to intersection points when the enemy is coming so you can cut them off. And we see some pilots undergoing additional training. So, this is all the preparations on the British side. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Germans are yucking it up because they think the radar masts on the English coasts are just radio direction finders. But the British actually had developed quite a cohesive framework for air defense throughout the 1930s. They didn't really get caught, with their pants down or anything. Robert Watson Watt was a scientist, and he had worked on high frequency radio and atmospheric research. And in 1932, he drafted a report that basically said, if an aircraft meets a shortwave radio pulse, it'll reflect a signal back to the ground, and you can measure that time lag between the reflection and hitting the ground in microseconds. And if you have a time base, the distance between the aircraft from the radio station can then be measured. And he wasn't the first person to discover this, but he was the first person to kind of develop it for this purpose. And so a team led by Watson Watt successfully used radio waves to detect aircraft for the first time in 1935. And this was the basis for the radar system that the British would build over the ensuing 5 years. They constructed all these radar bases along the coast, and these were used to detect incoming attacks from across the English Channel. But they were blind to their rear, which is where the rest of this defense system comes in. So after the radar alerts that the enemy planes are coming, information then gets passed to the observer corps inland. And these are literally people in buildings on hilltops, in fields. This is a very manual exercise. And they would track and pass on information about numbers of planes, altitude, trajectory, all this stuff to one another. And ultimately, onto the operations rooms of fighting sectors. So the whole time that planes are in British airspace, the British are tracking them and they know where they're going and how many of them there are and what's going on for the most part. And then once they get this information to the operations rooms of the fighting sectors, they can use these complex, for the time, radio technology and manual triangulation, and they can direct their own squadrons to intercept these enemy attacks. In particular, they had a navigation system called Pipsqueak, which used high frequency direction finding receivers to allow the British to plot the direction of their own fighters, because the pilots used to have to use dead reckoning. They really had no way of knowing where they were supposed to be going beyond manual navigation. And this also made it easier for the planes to be successfully guided back to base. So it was a big deal. And the Germans, perhaps because their own efforts were focused predominantly on offense, they really did not have, a vast sense of system of defense set up because they didn't think they were potentially going to need it. They had little notion of the complexity of the British defense system that they were taking on. They knew the British had radar, but they believed it rudimentary compared to their own systems.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because that's also what they thought about Enigma and whatever else there was going on the British and Allied side. So I feel like they underestimate their enemy quite extensively throughout the war.
Yeah, definitely a problem for sure for them.
I do like that this movie kind of shows you the entire chain from radar to the control room to the inland people. Like, you see all of them. That's quite interesting. I don't think modern movies would do that anymore. So it's quite nice to
Yeah.
see the entire chain.
And it's wild to think about now, right? But I mean, you would have to. If I'm in one area and I see, I don't know, 20 planes going overhead and I know what direction they're going, and I got to call you in your area and be like, I'm seeing all these planes, keep an eye out for them. And you're like, okay, I'm going to watch. And you're going to see where they're coming and you're going to track that information and we're all going to know where the planes are. I mean, nowadays we have the technology. We don't have to do this. This was a very complex system that involved a lot of people having to be good at their jobs.
And also not get shot in the meantime.
Well, for sure. I mean, we're going to talk more about the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAFs as they call them, in a bit. These were ladies who worked quite extensively in these control rooms, and literally there would be points where, I mean, and in the book, the authors are sure to give them credit. You know, these ladies, they kept cool heads. They were extremely competent. These rooms could not have been operated without them. There were women who, as the radar station they were working in were being bombed, they stayed at their post long after it was no longer safe because they knew that if they could get just a little bit more information inland about the attack that was coming, the fighter command would be able to muster the correct number of planes, the pilots would know it was coming, and fewer bombers would get through. So these women exhibited extraordinary courage. These people are unsung heroes, these people who did the work on the ground.
Yep. I wish we knew some of their names, but I don't think many of them are known. But there were many. I was quite surprised by how many there were. Anyway, back to the movie. The English are pleased by Hitler's delay after taking over France, and they are using it to their advantage, though Downing is very clear about the challenge that is in front of them because Germany has many, many more aircraft than the British do. And there's a little back and forth between the government minister and Downing where they're talking about, are you praying to God and trusting in radar? And Downing replies, I'm trusting in God, I'm praying for radar. That's funny.
Right. This system had never been used in warfare before. They're about to find out if it works. The Germans at this point, they had seen the Dunkirk evacuation, and when the British evacuated at Dunkirk, they left by the skin of their teeth, right? Like they left a whole bunch of equipment behind, tanks, like you name it. And so the Germans, perhaps rightly, saw this as a rout, and they figured the British are going to need, you know, they're in shambles right now. So Germany took its time preparing for its British offensive. They left the British like a month of breathing room until July 10th when they started their attacks in earnest. There's this weird sort of disconnect in intelligence between the two countries because of course at the time you can't text spy reports back and forth, right? It's like difficult. The Germans did try and parachute spies into Britain, but they almost always got caught immediately. It was a tough, tough road to hoe. And so the Germans didn't have great information. They believed rumors and sketchy intelligence about civil unrest in Britain, and they thought it was possible that the British government would even collapse after the Dunkirk evacuation. And so they just thought they had all the time in the world.
To me, that feels like a weird thing to believe after you've just seen the British people rescue their own men in their boats. Like, that's not a sign of unrest. That's a sign of
Right.
hope.
Prior to the war, there had been, you know, Oswald Mosley and British fascists. And so the Germans had heard about that kind of stuff. And they thought perhaps that the British were more conflicted than they were. But this happened throughout the war, right? I mean, both sides were convinced that they were going to be able to bomb each other's cities and destroy each other's morale. And of course, we know that that had completely the opposite effect. If anything, it made people keep calm and carry on even more.
Yeah.
Squadron leader Canfield, played by Michael Caine, is introduced to us as he's trying to track down a missing pilot who will turn up later, having been fished out of the channel. This movie has a dreadful case of all these white guys look the same, so I really wasn't able to keep track of a lot of the different pilots, but we'll do our best. Meanwhile, Harvey, our Canadian, has been reassigned to Scotland, and he wants his wife, Section Officer Maggie Harvey, played by Susanna York. She's a WAAF who works on the airbase. He wants her to apply for reassignment to go with him, but she's not keen. She's like, "Well, my job here is really important. Like, I want to actually, do it."
And she kept, like, putting off making the decision, too. And I don't think she ever makes it in the movie. She's just like, I'll
No.
do it. I promise I'll do it. And then the movie's over.
Yeah. The WAFs who worked in fighter command could be found in radar stations and operations rooms, compiling and analyzing data from across the defense system and plotting and mapping aircraft positions. A ground control interception unit had a controller and 4 operators. The operators were usually WAFs, and increasingly so were the controllers after 1941. And over 250,000 women served in the WAF. So pretty impressive.
I love the scenes in the control room with all the women. I feel like this movie has more women doing stuff than Masters of the Air does, which I think is
Literally.
kind of it's kind of damning, isn't it, to be 50 years on and have less women in your show.
I know. Brutal. This is the passage from the book that really reminded me that it was written in 1961. Control rooms were largely dependent on the WAAF. In the heat of battle, they were brave and their services were invaluable. When the fighting began to get tough and the language of the pilots started to match it, senior officers tried moving the girls beyond the earshot of the control room loudspeakers. It was not idle swearing, however, but the voices of men fighting for their lives. The girls refused to leave their jobs and said they did not mind the language as much as the men thought.
Oh man, not the women. Protect their ears.
Just the fact that he calls them the girls several times, I'm like, bro.
Yeah, but then they did put them all in the movie.
They
Um,
did. It was nice to see them, and, you actually got to see them doing their jobs. They weren't just, like, set decoration.
no, exactly. So the movie kind of moves on a little bit. It's August 13th, 1940, also known as Eagle Day. So in July, the Germans had mostly focused on mine laying in the Channel and the North Sea and targeting convoys and shipping. But after the beginning of August, much of the battle moved over to the island itself. So it was a real shift in the way they were conducting the war. We watched the Germans as they target many airfields and try to knock out the RAF on the ground because they say even a Spitfire can't be in two places at once. And this is where I find they make them a little bit silly, the Germans, because they say it in such a giddy way. I'm like, really? Are you just gonna make them look kind of stupid? But I guess.
The crazy thing is that that quote is a real quote. It also appeared in the book.
Yeah. So the Germans did really, really like the Spitfire, and I think they were like very afraid of that plane because it was quite a bit faster, I think, and was better at turning and all that stuff.
They each had their own. The ME-109s were better at climbing and diving, and the Spitfires were better at turning, and I think they had a comparable speed. But yeah, I mean, the Spitfire has really captured the popular imagination, right? Like it's the fighter plane of World War II in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, I do feel like the movie's trying to make that clear to you too, because the Germans mention it like maybe three times how great the Spitfires are. So obviously it's a British movie, so maybe that's why, but you know. So in the scene we also see more RAFs doing their very important jobs in the control room. I love these scenes, they are the best. In the same scene we see that two of the British radar stations are knocked out of action in a very dramatic explosion, and this means that the RAF have to rely on the observer corps that Sam mentioned before, and some airfields were heavily damaged, but the casualties are light, so not too many people died, but we do see a lot of explosions.
Yeah, lots of practical effects. I did particularly enjoy watching that hangar blow up.
That's also the scene where we see all the ladies, right? The rafts on the base, I believe.
Don't remember. I'll take your word for it.
Maybe. Anyway, there's a scene where we see Harvey's wife on the base, and she's working with, I'm guessing, a superior officer, a man, and he reminds her that I think it's like something to do with a gas mask, and he reminds her that they are meant for the gas mask, not as a handbag, which I thought was a really shitty remark to make.
Yeah. I mean, I won't say that the presentation of women in this movie is perfect. There's another scene where she lights a cigarette where she's not supposed to, etc. But I mean, is what it is.
Yeah,
It's 1969.
and that's true.
So on Eagle Day, up to this point, the Germans and the British are flying maybe a few hundred sorties a day. Like a sortie is a mission. If you were a fighter pilot, you would fly, we talked about this in our Pierre Klosterman episode. You might fly two or three missions a day. You wouldn't always just be one and done. The Germans flew 1,485 sorties on Eagle Day, which is quite a lot more than they had up to that time. 2 days later, they flew 1,786 sorties on August 15th, and the following day, 1,715. So this is a marked uptick. Pilot's life expectancy at this point was just 87 flying hours.
It's only a couple of days then, that's not great. Further German attacks on the southern English airfields occur for the ensuing days. So we see a lot of air battles and dogfights, and the dogfights are really, really awesome. But then Canfield, played by Michael Caine, is shot down. And you're like, no, not Canfield, because Canfield has a dog on the base. And after he's shot down, we get a little glimpse of his dog looking sad.
I was mostly sad he was shot down because he was one of the few people I recognized from scene to scene because I was like, "It's Michael Caine."
Yeah, that's true. There's maybe three recognizable people in this movie. That's Christopher Plummer, Michael Caine, and there's another blonde guy that we couldn't find out his name, but his name is just Squadron Leader Skipper, which is just a general name. And he's blonde and kind of interesting looking, but other than that, everybody looks the same.
Yeah, so in real life, around this point, the Germans begin to make a succession of strategic errors, and at this point, Goering makes the mistake of ordering that the Luftwaffe are going to take the focus off of attacking radar stations because it's pretty tough to damage them. It's really easy to focus on hitting, for example, the very visible aerial tower, but the bulk of what makes a radar station work is what is in the buildings that are on and under the ground. And so the Germans were finding that even though they bombed them a whole bunch, they were not taking them out of service. But I mean, realistically, right? Like, this is how the British know when you're coming. So they probably should have kept up a focus on that, but they decided not to.
Whoop whoop.
The commanding officer of RAF 11 Group, and this is the fighter group catching the bulk of the shit from the Germans because 11 Group covers London and surrounding area. And so they're very busy, as you can imagine. His name's Keith Park, and he's played by Trevor Howard. And this commanding officer of RAF 12 Group, which is the group that gets called on to reinforce 11 Group quite a lot. This is Trafford Lee Mallory, played by Patrick Weimark. These two are at odds over the proper technique for countering German attacks. So Lee Mallory of 12 Group, he has this big wing tactic, he calls it. And he thinks that the best way of countering German attacks is if you assemble 40 to 50 aircraft at 15,000 feet. However, Park says this is super unwieldy. It takes a long time. It's difficult to get 40 to 50 aircraft to be able to fly in sequence. Like, you're spending a lot of time getting that many planes into formation. And at that point, the bombers are getting through. And this was a real life major conflict. I don't know if this specific conversation happened, but these two guys were definitely at loggerheads about it. And Dowding would end up getting in trouble a little bit later because he didn't resolve this issue satisfactorily while he was in command. But in the movie, he points out the real problem here is lack of pilots. He's like, well, it doesn't really matter what formations we fly if we don't have enough guys. And this conflict eventually cost Keith Park, the CEO of RAF 11 Group, his command, though he later was shifted to a command at Malta in 1942, and he proved the results of his smaller squadron approach.
Yay! Thankfully, otherwise he would have had a shitty rest of his career, probably. I do like Laurence Olivier as Danny in this. I thought he was interesting and also kind of pessimistic the entire movie.
For sure.
Everyone else is like, oh, we'll fix it. And he's like, with whose pilots? But they do have a secret weapon, which they are reluctant to use, which is the foreign pilots that we'll get to in a bit. So, this is a bit of a turning point in a war. We get to see a squadron of German bombers. They are lost in bad weather at night, and they accidentally jettison their bombs over London. And the RAF then retaliates by attacking Berlin, and this is kind of the accidental start of the Blitz.
Yeah, it's definitely the catalyzing event. I think the official quote unquote start of the Blitz is September 7th. That's when the Germans really start the daylight attacks in earnest. But yeah, the German bombers, they jettison their bombs over London. And the Germans had been bombing the outskirts of London, but this is, they're dropping bombs right in the middle. And this happens on the 24th of August, and the RAF retaliates the next night on the 25th. And the British intended to hit industrial and communications targets, but they also had bad weather, and this led to a lot of non military targets being hit.
A big oops.
Yeah, so of course, as you can imagine, Hitler is not very happy about this. We get to see him making a big, frothy, angry speech because what World War II movie would be complete without that? And he retaliates. And this is a second strategic error by the Germans because instead of focusing on getting rid of the airfields and taking out the RAF, which has been the goal up to this point, they give the airfields a break and they bomb London instead. And Hermann Goering, played by Hein Rees, is still convinced that the Germans have the British against the ropes. They really have this sense in their minds because they're getting these crazy reports, right? They're hearing that they're downing 70 British planes at a time, and we know that that's not correct. and that pretty frequently the reports of fighter squadrons would be wrong because many reasons. If I hit a plane and you hit a plane and we both claim it, that's twice as many planes as actually went down. So he's still convinced that the British are really taking it. We'll ramp up the pressure. And on September 7th, 1940, we see him turn up at Pas de Calais on the French coast to command the daytime assault on London.
This portrayal of Hermann Goering, he's such a they make him such a clown. I can't take him seriously, but we know he was pretty, like, not clowny.
Goering was a World War I fighter ace and obviously a big supporter of Hitler's and quite powerful in the Reich. At one point, he just had so many different job titles. It makes you wonder, how was he good at carrying out any of them? But because he had flown a World War I, right, which was really the first conflict where airplanes actually featured, he wasn't a big technology guy. All of his thoughts about strategy were pretty out of date, and he wasn't really interested in learning more. And had that not been the case, the Germans' strategy and tactics might have been different.
So there is another pilot that we've kind of seen around. His name is Andy, and he's played by Ian McShane. This is one of the pilots I could actually recognize because he's got quite a distinctive mop of black hair. So yeah, someone I know. But he returns to London on leave, and he discovers that his wife and children, who he had sent away to the country, have returned to London, and he's not very pleased about it. But he gives his kids cute little Spitfire miniatures that I want, please. Thank you. And then there is a call for volunteers to help get a family that's trapped by the bombing, and he volunteers to go on it. And he's fine, like he does what he's supposed to do. But then he gets back to the resting center that his wife and his kids were staying at and finds out that it's been bombed and they've died, which so sad. Why?
I guess. I struggle to care about these pilots that I barely recognize, but I understand that
Fair.
I'm supposed to. I did recently see Ian McShane in a shitty horror movie with that also had Renee Zellweger in it, and I was like, if you hear the name Ian McShane, you might not picture a face in your mind, but if you saw his face, you would recognize him. He's been in like a million things. The RAF begins to train foreign pilots from German-occupied countries. This includes, of course, Poland and Czechoslovakia. These pilots struggle a little with the English language, but there's a funny scene where they're being led by an English squadron leader, and every time he gives them instructions, they go, "What? Say again?" And he repeats the instruction, and they go, "Please repeat, say again." And he says it again, and he's getting more and more agitated. And then he realizes after like the sixth or seventh say again that the Poles are doing what he told them to do. They're just fucking with him. Anyway, I quite like that little scene. They prove their mettle when they brazenly attack an unescorted group of bombers. And this is good because the new British pilots coming up are very green. We see a scene where they're talking about this one guy's like, "Oh, yeah, I have 8 hours of flight time on a Spitfire or something," which is, not a lot of time and often results in pilots getting killed before they can even get battle experience. So,
Yeah, I feel like the other pilot, Jamie, has to lead those pilots, and he's like, what the fuck? Why am I getting these babies to lead? Just stick by me and do what I tell you to do. Burke and Dowding discuss how the German strategic change from bombing the airfields and airplane factories to bombing London will be beneficial because the RAF can recover and the Germans don't have much feather left by the time they get to London. This is to do with fuel and stuff, right? So they can't really go anywhere once they get there, and that's obviously a good thing. Sure enough, the next time the Germans attack during the day, they are routed by the RAF fighters. So they're like, guess what, motherfuckers? We're right here. Goering orders the fighters to stay with the bombers, which is not their purpose. They are supposed to be fighting with the RAF, but he tells them to stay. But that leaves them vulnerable to be attacked themselves, so the Germans begin to lose a couple more planes.
yeah, we see one of the German officers snidely ask Goering for an outfit of Spitfires for my squadron. And this is based on Adolf Galland, who was a World War II flying ace and flight group commander who consulted on this movie. And he did say that to Goering at one point, supposedly, out of frustration at being given unmanageable orders. And interestingly, I read that Galland supposedly had some beef with some of the movie's depictions of the Germans, of course. He argued in particular that Operation Sea Lion, which was the German plan to invade Britain, was actually just a bluff to get the British to accept Hitler's peace terms as it prepared to invade the Soviet Union, and it was never a serious proposition. However, I mean, the goal of the attacks on Britain was to ready it for invasion and achieve air supremacy. It was also to succeed at Goering's personal ambition of destroying the RAF and bringing Britain down by air power alone. He kept telling Hitler, "Oh, yeah, don't worry about it. Like, you're barely going to need to invade. I'm going to destroy everything that needs to be destroyed from the air." Just wild hubris. And the Germans were so confident that Operation Sea Lion would eventually go ahead once they had air superiority that they deliberately left some southern English ports alone for use during the invasion. 13 German army divisions had been moved to embarkation points on the French coast, and there was a detailed plan in place for a landing. There were over 1,000 invasion craft massed in ports along the channel, plus 600 more upriver at Antwerp. So if it's a bluff, like Galland is saying, it's a pretty fucking expensive bluff.
Yeah, those are a lot of crafts, and even all the way up to Antwerp. So, like, that's also not a thing you do in a day. Like, that's a week-long operation, I'd say. So, we move forward again. On September 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe makes its biggest and most focused attack yet on London. And at this point, a British squadron is in the air with no reserves. If they go down, that's it. They don't have any reserves. And the fighting is very heavy. Harvey is shot down, and he survives, but he is terribly wounded and burned, which is interesting because his wife Maggie, who had just met badly burned squadron leader Evans, played by Bill Foxley, walks off when she hears that her husband has been badly burned, which is kind of, I don't know what to think about this. She's like, I don't want to deal with that. Maybe. We don't know. It's kind of left in the air, literally.
Squadron Leader Evans, played by Bill Foxley. Bill Foxley was a real World War II veteran. Well, I don't know if it was him, but they crashed their bomber during a training exercise in 1944, and he actually escaped unharmed, but his crewmates were still in the plane, so he went back to get them. 3 of them survived, including him, out of 6. But he was quite badly burned. He needed something like 29 operations. If you look up a picture of this guy, it's very, I mean, given the medical technology at the time, they really did their best. Yeah, he went on to live a long life. He talked about how when he would sit on the train to go into town, people would always leave an empty seat next to him because, he's quite disfigured and people have certain feelings about that. So, yeah, that did make me a little sad to read about, but I did think it was cool that he got to be in this movie.
As someone with burns, like, it feels kind of like justice to be in this movie, I guess. After people have just been ignoring you for looking that way.
Yeah. So in real life, after the massive daylight raid on London on September 7th, which is sort of the unofficial start of the Blitz, followed by another a week later on the 15th of September, which is known as Battle of Britain Day in the UK, because I think that's when people started to get a sense that the tides were turning. The Germans had to rethink their strategy because it had started to become really clear that fighter command was not as close to the brink as they thought. Hitler had to push back Operation Sea Lion until further notice, and they shifted their focus back to trying to obliterate the RAF again. Goering still believed it could be done in 4 to 5 days because that's what had happened in Poland and France. But in those countries, there hadn't really been a significant air defense to shatter. Right. So, really, it doesn't make any sense why he would think that. But he kept telling Hitler, like, yeah, 4 or 5 days. We got it. It's on lock.
Nope.
In the movie, the next day, everyone is geared up for another massive raid, but it just doesn't happen. We get a scene where all the pilots are sitting around outside in the sunshine. This is in parallel to a similar scene at the beginning, but in the beginning, everyone's kind of joking around, having a good time. Now they've been through too much shit, man. They're sitting there and they're all pensive, gazing off into the middle distance. And then across the channel, we see the German air forces leave the coast, furious Goering among them, hollering angrily out the window at his subordinates.
I did like this ending, the clear skies after seeing all the German fighters and the bombers in there before, and now it's sunny and beautiful. I did like the ending. It does end quite suddenly. I kind of wish we'd gotten to see our Canadian, but I guess he's just somewhere being disfigured.
Yeah. And I mean, this whole thing where they rout the Germans and then the Germans never come back is obviously not 100% accurate. The Germans weren't defeated in one day like that. On September 19th, Hitler ordered the assembly of the invasion fleet to be stopped and dispersed because, of course, if you have a bunch of craft on the channel, lots of opportunities for the British to bomb the shit out of it, which was happening. And a couple weeks later, on October 12th, he decided that he would postpone Operation Sea Lion until at least the spring. And of course, we know that it never ended up happening. And daytime attacks by the Germans dwindled by the end of October. So it did take another month or so.
The movie closes on Downing looking up at the sky, as we were just saying, where the Churchill quote appears. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. I do love this quote. It's a beautiful quote.
Epic quote, yeah. Dowding lost his post in November of 1940, about a month or so later. After he retired in 1942, supposedly they asked him to write an official report of the Battle of Britain, which was never published. Instead, the Air Ministry wrote its own history without even mentioning his name. There are several reasons for this. At that point, the British were turning to offense instead of defense, of course. Now they're no longer having to defend their own island. So it's going to be less predominantly focused on fighter command. Now it's going to be a bit more focused on bomber command because now they're trying to go out and bomb the Germans. Not necessarily his specialty. So he was removed from that post. Also, they were upset that he had taken CO Park's side, more or less, in the big wing debate, and he hadn't ended up resolving that, and it had caused a lot of problems and tension in the fighter commands during the Battle of Britain. And he also had a few political enemies, and so he lost his job. And initially, there was a bit of a shadow over his name, but Churchill stood up for him, and so his reputation has been somewhat restored, I think.
I mean, I would say I don't know a lot about him other than what I've just seen in this movie. But I think it's kind of rude just to not mention him at all in this entire report of his petal. Like, Dunning, who's that?
Yeah. And then we get an end card. I'm not going to read all of this because it's just a bunch of numbers and y'all aren't going to remember anyways. But we get an end card that says, in tribute to the Allied pilots who took part in the Battle of Britain. And then it lists where the pilots were from and how many participated and how many were killed. So, of course, the RAF and other Commonwealth. There was also the Fleet Air Arm of the Navy. So they also contributed pilots. And of course, we have Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, South Africans, Southern Rhodesians, Irish, American, Polish, Czech, Belgian, Free French. And they've listed one Israeli pilot. Israel did not exist yet when this happened. I believe it was a British man who was just born in the British Mandate of Palestine, but regardless, that gets mentioned. There's also a card that shows German losses during the Battle of Britain, and these were estimates available at the time, but subsequent research has demonstrated most of them are grossly overestimated for the reasons we talked about before. Pilots just tend to be not very accurate when they report how many planes they've shot down. But bomber crews, 1,176 killed in action. Stuka crews, Stukas, those are the dive bombers, 85 killed in action. Fighter bomber crews, 212 killed in action. Fighter pilots, 171 killed in action. And missing crews, 1,445. I suspect those missing crews were killed in action.
Most likely, or drowned. Like, a lot of them would just end up in the drink, as they say.
Right. And up until pretty deep into the Battle of Britain, the British in particular didn't have a great system coordinated for fishing airmen out of the channel. This was something that they hastily had to develop on the fly.
Yeah, and that's
And
where the movie ends. I didn't even finish watching the end cards, I'll be honest with you. I was kind of done. I was like, oh, this movie is too long.
yeah, it definitely started to feel that way a little bit. Yeah. This movie used 100 real aircraft, making it the 35th largest air force in the world at the time. As you can imagine, in 1969, I don't know how effective of an air force it would have been with a lot of World War II planes, but nevertheless, it gives you some idea of the size. And I was reading a little bit about this, and it's so interesting. So, if they didn't have a make and model of Spitfire or Messerschmitt that was available in the summer and fall of 1940, they might use a later model and repaint it or tweak it a little bit. Same thing, if they didn't have a particular bomber, they would take a bomber that they did have and they would kind of rejig it or film it from certain angles or add little bits and pieces to it to make it look like a make and model that it wasn't. So I thought that was really cool to read about all the work they put into that.
They also used radio, what do you call it? Like miniatures that
Yeah,
are,
like remote control planes.
yeah, they look pretty neat. Like, I would want one, I'd go nuts.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, and they really made the most of, if they so the 2 British fighter planes that were predominantly used were the Hurricane and the Spitfire, and though the Spitfire has captured the popular imagination, there were more Hurricanes than Spitfires used, and the Spitfires were faster, so they would take on the fighter planes, and then the Hurricanes would take on the bombers, so that's kind of how the separation of duties worked out. But anyway, so they had a few Hurricanes that they had gotten for the movie, and some of them could only taxi, they couldn't actually fly. So you'll see a shot of some hurricanes taxiing by, and of course, just out of frame, they're not really taking off up into the air, but it looks real while you're watching it.
Smart movie making. There is a movie called Hurricane. I think it's about Polish pilots. I think we should watch it.
Yeah, I'm for sure down. The operations room used in the film is the real operations room for Number 11 Fighter Command, which, as we mentioned, was the group of fighter command getting the most battering during the Battle of Britain. You can actually visit it today at RAF Uxbridge. It's a little museum, so that's kind of cool.
Neat. I would love to go there sometime. I'll have to get back to the UK at some point.
Yeah, for sure. There's a sequence in one of the aerial battles where a pilot, played by Edward Fox, takes down a badly damaged bomber, which crashes spectacularly into a railway station. And rather than really remembering what the pilot's doing, I mean, in my memory anyway, you mostly remember the practical effects. You're like, cool, a big explosion. But the pilot is based on a real guy named Ray Holmes, who on the 15th of September, 1940, rammed his Hurricane into a bomber over London when his guns locked up and he had no other way of taking it down. Holmes survived and was praised as a hero, of course. His plane rammed into the ground at 350 miles per hour to the point where they couldn't get it out. So they just left it there until May 2004. And he was there as an honorary guest when it had to be moved to make way for a new water main.
He survived? Wow.
Yeah, I believe
That's
he
wild.
parachuted to safety. Yeah.
Ah, thank God.
A number of subsequent films, including Midway, which came out in 1976, borrowed stock footage from this movie. And we have discussed potentially covering Midway pretty soon, so keep an eye out for that. And Michael Caine's spoken cameo in Dunkirk, the 2017 movie, which we have covered, so go check that out, as a Spitfire pilot, is a little nod to his role in this movie.
Yes. I love Michael Caine. I'm sad that he died in this one.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Caine, Laurence Olivier, there's a pretty stacked cast. Christopher
Yeah.
Plummer.
Yep. If only their characters had a little more character to them, that would have been
Yeah.
great.
Could have used a little more meat for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think we should get to rating this movie, and I had a fabulous idea for rating this because there's a lot of mentions and visual stuff about tea in this movie. So I think we should rate it at least there's tea out of 10.
It's true. That really seems to be the epitome, the symbol of the British stiff upper lip, the keep calm and carry on. They're like, well, you know what? We're getting the shit bombed out of us. Make a cuppa.
Like, they're up on some roof in London, I think, and there's some guy holding a teapot.
Yeah.
You go first. You rate it first.
All right. I would give this movie 6 at least there's teas out of 10. It really captures my imagination that they use so many real planes from World War II and that they use practical effects, and the aerial combat scenes look really cool. I mean, if you're into that, I definitely recommend watching them. There were some little funny moments. The acting was pretty good. I like that they showed the WAFs and they gave us one with a name who had things to do. And despite the fact that I found the book dry, I did learn a ton of stuff. It was like taking a crash course, man. Like, there was no narrative in this book. It was like, you're going to learn some fucking facts about the Battle of Britain, so buckle in. And I did. I know more about liquid cooled versus air cooled engines than I ever desired or even thought that I could know. But yeah, that said, it is a little lengthy, it's kinda dry in places, and they didn't do a great job of pulling the narrative together. It's really just like, "Here's what happened, and then this, and then this, and then this." And so it's not a terrifically interesting watch unless you're someone who likes when history movies are almost documentary-like, in which case, then this is the movie for you. What did you think?
I also want to rate this 6, at least there's cheese out of 10. Because, like you, I find the subject matter quite interesting and I didn't know a lot about it. And it's a good, like, entry point into learning more about the Battle of Britain. But as a movie, it's not very interesting. It's like, it's okay, it's not a waste of time, but it's also not one I'd watch again. So, short and sweet for me, I think.
Are you reading anything?
I am, in fact, reading something again. I got back into Mission Europe by Kate Figures, which is about the SOE in Europe, in different countries. And it's
Nice.
super interesting. I really like reading about the SOE. How about you? What have you been up to since your super dry book, The Narrow Margin?
I took a little break from World War II, and I've just finished. I finished it last night. Boudica: The Life and Legends of Britain's Warrior Queen by Vanessa Collingridge. I think similar to the Battle of Britain, Boudica looms pretty large in the British imagination as, a warrior queen, I suppose. The book was interesting because we don't know a lot about her life, but the author gave a lot of context about the history of the Roman Empire around that time, what was happening, what life was like for the Celtic tribes who were living in England, and also talked quite a lot about her legacy and how that's impacted female monarchs and female leaders since then, and the impact that she's had on the popular imagination. Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Yay, love that. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you, everybody, for listening. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and rate us 5 stars. Please do, we'd love that. You can send this episode to a friend who needs to learn more about the Battle of Midway. Not Midway, about the Battle of.
Midway on the Brain. There's gonna be planes in that one too.
Stop it, you're making me laugh. You can send this episode to a friend who needs to learn more about the Battle of Britain like we did. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website at rosieTheReviewer.com. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.